All right, here we go again. This particular lecture is about psychological disorders, and it's exciting because I have a feeling that you've been waiting for this lecture for the whole course, because this is where we talk about what goes wrong with us, the many, 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 many problems that can happen in our mental processes and behaviors. And what you're going to see is how everything that you've done so far in this class has prepared you for this lecture. Because one of the things that you've been doing is you've been paying attention to the definition of things, how one thing is a little bit different than another thing. And what you're going to see when you study psychological disorders is that the definition of things is the key to understanding whether one disorder is this one or that one, and whether we treat it this way or that way. So let's get into it. Now, first of all, what do we mean by an abnormal behavior? So, a psychological disorder is considered to sort of defined as an abnormal behavior. And there are four different ways of understanding what's abnormal, right? Because even that word has some um, ambiguity to it. So, there's deviance, dysfunction, distress, and danger. In other words, if it's unusual and unaccepted by social norms, if it interferes with your life or other people's lives, that's dysfunction. It's distressing, means it's upsetting to you or other people, or it's dangerous. It could be putting your life or other people's life in danger. So those are what we look at when we think about abnormal behavior. So just walking down the street doing a silly walk, yeah, that might be a little bit deviant, but it may not rise to the level of being completely unacceptable. So when we think about deviance and its relationship to social norms, we have to think about what a social norm is. It can be thought of as a belief about what others will and will not find find acceptable. And so I have some pictures here of things that once upon a time were thought to be normal and also thought to be abnormal. For example, here you see a picnic ground filled with litter. When I was growing up, we littered all the time. It wasn't until I was 9 or 10, 8, 7, 8, 9 or something, when there was a big campaign. Woodsy the Owl said, "Give a hoot, don't pollute." And it basically taught all of us kids to pester our parents to stop littering. And then the social norm became, don't be a litter bug. And people stopped littering to the degree that they used to. Similarly, here you have two men getting married. Wasn't too long ago when that would have been the most shocking thing in the world. And now it's on primetime TV. And probably many of you know people and have family members who are married to somebody of the same sex. Here you have a woman ripping off her shirt. This was, I think, was it Brandi Chastain when the women's soccer won the U.S. Cup? She's so excited and she ripped off her shirt. And at the time, there were people going, "Oh my, she shouldn't have ripped off her shirt." Because there was a time when, like, I'm even going to do it, showing your bra strap was considered unbelievably inappropriate. Now, here's a norm that I find disturbing, which is the norm of white supremacy and expressing white supremacist belief. That was utterly outrageous to do in polite society, and increasingly it's something that people think they can say outrageous, racist things and get away with it. So there's a social norm that's changing. So, if these then I ask you, how have these norms changed over time? And what does deviance mean if social norms are changing? That's just something for you to reflect on. Now, I want you to know that something about the prevalence of mental illness, like how often, how many of us have it. 1 in 5 adults in America have experienced a mental illness. So at some point in our lives, if we were in a classroom, I'd say there'd be 5 to 10 of us who've experienced a mental illness in our lifetime, and I'd raise my hand. I'd say, I have as well. There, at the same time, there are a lot of Americans who constantly live with a mental illness. So here's where I got my stats, but what I want you to reflect on is if 1 in 5 experience mental illness, is that then maybe normal? Is there some degree of normal if 1 in 5 go through this? So, part of why I'm posing these questions is because of the issue of stigma around mental illness. So, for a long time, and we're going to get into it in the next slide, but mental illness has been seen as a terrible thing. Like, there's something terribly wrong with you if your mind doesn't work right for, a year or two. Like, because nobody knew what to do to help people. So people often were given up on. And also, there are beliefs that the mentally ill are weak. They just aren't strong enough to resist the forces, that they're dangerous or that they're incompetent, that people get angry at people with mental illness or they're afraid of people with mental illness. And they tend to be suspicious of them so that jobs are withheld, housing withheld, and even empathy. Like, that's one of the problems with stigma. But there's another side of stigma that's a problem that I want to point out, which is it can make people who feel like they might be suffering a mental illness have a stigma against themselves. They believe that they're weak, unworthy, defective, incompetent. They may have shame, fear, self-loathing, and despair if they're that much different than everyone else. And they may avoid getting jobs, housing. They may avoid being themselves, showing who they really are. So stigma is a problem. And what I want you to reflect on with this is, do you think stigma is changing? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? So reflect on that. Now, let's go over a timeline about mental illness. Way back in, until about the 1700s, people thought that these strange behaviors that they saw in people sometimes were caused by evil spirits. So, what did they do to treat them? They drilled holes in their skulls, they conducted exorcisms, they prescribed fasting and prayer, they administered beatings and sometimes burned them at the stake. For example, I don't know if you know who Joan of Arc is, but she was somebody before the 1700s who a woman who led France in a victorious battle against England, and she said she was guided by angels and the powers that be. It turned out that she just won a great battle, but England won the war, so they burned her at the stake, claiming that she had evil spirits. So here comes the 1700s. Remember how we learned about when we learned that suddenly there was linear perspective and a vanishing point? That we learned about that when we were talking about perception. Well, also in the 1700s, there was a different way to think about people who were suffering. They thought we shouldn't drill holes in their head. We shouldn't burn them at the stake. Let's give them a place to live where they don't disturb society, and maybe they can rest and get better. So, you know what the word asylum means? Asylum means here's a safe place for you. Unfortunately, which is true with most of the history of mental illness, the good intentions of creating a safe asylum turned into a problem because before long they became overcrowded. They got staffed with people who were underpaid, who didn't care, who didn't understand. Inmates started being shackled in dark and unheated cells, and these insane asylums were considered to be hell on earth. Now, here comes Philippe Pinel in the 1800s, and he went into these asylums with more compassion and more of an idea that actually maybe there's something physically going wrong. And so he worked with many asylum inmates, gave them some underlying medical treatment of their underlying medical care, and cured many people. So he developed this medical model that if you're behaving strangely, there might be something very wrong with you physically. Now here comes psychiatry, and who's associated with psychiatry? Freud. And we've studied a lot of different things that Freud contributed to, but in this, one of his major contributions was The idea that our unconscious drives were leading us to behave in certain ways. So people's behaviors were influenced by mental processes, not just physical. But some of these mental processes are completely unconscious, and they are our inner drives for sex and aggression that are in conflict with our moral teachings. And so that creates tensions and it makes us nuts. That was his basic idea. Much more complicated than that. And now here comes psychology. Really took root in the 1950s. Some of my favorites, like Carl, you'll see, the humanists are coming on board, and they're seeing people as whole individuals with basic goodness, and they're seeing, and there's also cognitive psychology. So let's go and see the many different perspectives in psychology. um, you know, as we started out at the beginning of the year, we knew there were many different perspectives on psychology itself. Well, here we see another chart that maps to a lot of those same ideas about the different perspectives on what causes psychological disorder. So maybe Freud was right, and it's our unconscious motivations. Maybe something went wrong in our brain and we just think funny. Maybe we have biological problems. For example, we could have a brain bleed, a brain aneurysm going on in a slow bleed, making us behave strangely. There could be sociocultural problems, especially if we're not getting on board with the beliefs and values of our culture. They're going to call us deviant, right? There could be behavioral. When we see this, we remember that's learning, behavioral problems. What we learned, we were taught and rewarded for being dysfunctional, perhaps. There could be evolutionary, where some motive that we had to say, we need people to survive when we're little babies. We need attachment. We need somebody to care for us. So maybe our basic drive to be cared for makes us behave in some exaggerated, unproductive way. So we're craving, like a codependent craving and clinging to people. And then there's the humanistic perspective, where your innate drive to be all you can be is blocked and it's causing distress and disorder. Here's some distinctions in terminology. Neurosis is an outmoded term, but essentially, back in, say, Freud's day and maybe before the 50s, they looked at neurosis and psychosis. Psychosis was thought to be a lost contact with reality, and it was initially thought to be untreatable. Like once they go over the, cuckoo bin or whatever, once they lose touch with reality, initially they thought they couldn't be treated. Neurosis was um, a mental disorder that was where you don't have grossly irrational thinking, you don't violate basic norms, but you're in deep distress. And then the last term I want you to pay attention to is the term insanity. Even though there used to be insane asylums, these days we don't call people with mental disorders insane, because insane is a legal designation. If you watch Law and Order, you may see people plead the insanity defense. It basically means somebody can't be held responsible for their actions. Okay? There are different assessments. We looked at them some before when we studied personality. But neurological tests are important. That's the first thing you've got to rule out. If you see strange behavior, maybe somebody's having seizures. Like we need to understand whether there's a physical problem. Clinical interviews are the most common. That's basically where a clinical psychologist sits down and asks you the kind of questions that elicit answers that will lead to a diagnosis. And I'm going to tell you more about that more. And here, remember, we studied psychological tests in an earlier lesson. So now, the diagnosis. There's like the Bible of diagnosis, and it's called the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And this particular one is the DSM-5. That means it's the fifth version. And essentially, it's a list and categorization of all the mental disorders and their diagnostic criteria. Now, I'm going to walk you through a diagnostic criteria. This is important because usually, if insurance is going to pay for something, it needs to be a diagnosed mental disorder. So, this becomes very important. But here's an example of the diagnosis for borderline personality disorder. So, the basic definition is it's a pervasive pattern of instability in interpersonal relationships, self image, and affects or emotion, and marked impulsivity beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts, as indicated by 5 or more of the following. And here you see 9 different qualities that a person may have. And if a person has 5 or more, they're said to have borderline personality disorder. I'm not going to go through all 9, but I want to present them to you. And note here, like, here's impulsivity and self-damaging behavior. This is criteria 4. And note how they separate this out from the 5th criteria, which is recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, threats. But you see here that there are also certain types of behaviors, like chronic feelings of emptiness is not mutually exclusive from depression. So if a person only had chronic feelings of emptiness, it might not be the best diagnosis. This borderline person, I'm sorry, chronic feelings of emptiness. You need more than this. So inappropriate and intense anger. Sometimes it says transient. That means sometimes. Every now and then there may be stress-related paranoid ideation. That means they're not paranoid all the time. But when the stress gets really high, they may have some paranoid ideas. There's a big, huge fear of abandonment. There's an unstable sense of self. Sometimes you're the greatest. Sometimes you're the worst. Sometimes you're the greatest. Sometimes you're the worst. Sort of waffling back and forth. And then there's a pattern of intense personal relationships where you idealize people, they're the best, and then suddenly they're the worst and you cut them off. So, me personally, I've been reading a lot about this diagnosis. That's why I wanted to share it with you, because I've been reading about it and thinking about it and thinking, where has this been all my life? Because this explains the behavior of a lot of my own youthful struggles and a lot of people that I know in my life. So this has become interesting to me, not because I want to run around and diagnose them with borderline personality, but because I want to know about these clusters of behavior. And I've been reading about the treatment of this particular one. And maybe if you find yourself a little bit like this, then the treatment of this extreme version could actually help you, even if you're not um, diagnosable to a destructive degree. So there are so many categories of psychological disorder. Anxiety, somatoform means body, mood disorders, personality disorders, schizophrenia, dissociative. We're going to go through these. But I want to give you this hopefully overwhelming list of subcategories of mental disorders. There's so many different ways that people can have a hard time, right? And there's so many different ways to treat them. Why do we have so many different categories? Because we think about how to treat them in different ways. And we work and so that's uh and hopefully our efforts to try to treat them are studied rigorously with empirical evidence. And this degree of compartmentalizing things from, like here we have, like, my least favorite is elimination disorders, problems related to the inappropriate elimination of urine or feces. And then as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about talking to you and how I was going to make a funny face. And I was even going to make fun of it. And then I was like, oh my God, people suffer with this. How insensitive of me that I would like treats an eating disorder, which is something that I suffered with more respect than something like that. It's just not fair of me. So I just wanted to let you know, there I was preparing for this lecture, coming face to face with my own leftover stigma for things. Anyway, so let's talk about anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders is probably the thing that you're relating to the most. if your shares and lecture responses have been any indication, so many of my class, in every class that I teach, experience anxiety, sometimes to the point of it being disorder, such as having panic attacks. It's when your anxiety is uncontrollable and it's disabling or it's disruptive and it's getting in the way with your everyday life. Sometimes I have, in fact, in the past week, had anxiety that made me lose some hours in my day. I don't know if that qualifies as a disorder, but if that went on day after day after day after day, it might. So here are basically the three categories of major anxiety disorders. General, that means you're just worried and you don't know what it's attached to. Panic disorder, a friend of mine just had a panic disorder, called me to make sure that I could check in on her kid. Her heart was beating, she felt dizzy, difficult breathing. Some people confuse this for a heart attack. Now, if you think you have symptoms of a heart attack, get it checked out. Don't dismiss it as it's just a panic disorder. You're so much better off having real doctors tell you it's just a panic disorder than to die of a heart attack, because they can kind of be confused. And then here we have phobias. This is like a persistent, intense, irrational fear and avoidance of a specific object, activity, or situation. So here's agoraphobia is a fear of open public spaces. You can have a phobia of elevators or spiders or escalators. You can have social phobias, a fear of public speaking, very common, maybe one of the most common fears. Causes of anxiety disorder are multiple and many. So maybe you learned to think or understand the world in a way that caused you to fear, say, um, I won't think of an example for that, but or there could be maladaptive learning. Remember, here's a picture of little Albert who was made to fear little fuzzy things. Maybe there's a biological reason for your anxiety disorder. For example, many believe that there's a predisposition to be afraid of snakes and afraid of spiders. They're scary. Couple that with being surrounded by other people who are afraid of snakes. It's going to maybe be a combination of an evolutionary reason and a maladaptive learning. There are some people who may have a genetic predisposition for fear. There are some people that are more sensitive to fearful stimuli. There may be biochemical disturbances, like here we have a skull in the picture of the coffee foam, too much coffee or too much of a substance that is making you imbalanced, causing you anxiety. Now, here's an interesting one, which is sociocultural pressures. So here I have some folks from Japan, and this is a particular phobia that they've named in Japan, but we don't really talk about in the United States because we don't have the same cultural oppression. It's called Tajin Kyofushu. Forgive my pronunciation. It's a kind of social phobia characterized by a terrible, terrible, debilitating fear of offending others through awkward social or physical behavior, such as if you accidentally stare too long, if you offend somebody. It's so awful in Japan to give offense to people, or if you blush, or if you have an odor, or if your facial expression betrays something that causes offense, or if your hands start to tremble, things that you can't control. Because the social pressure in Japan to not cause offense is so great that people have developed really debilitating phobias over this. Obsessive compulsive disorder is like anxiety, but it's like anxiety on steroids. It is characterized by persistent unwanted thoughts, fearful thoughts. That's the obsessive part. And or irresistible urges to perform repetitive and or ritualized behaviors. So here I have a picture of a toaster, because in one book that I read about OCD, one woman was so afraid that her toaster was going to catch on fire and burn the house down and all her loved ones with it, because that's the nature. It's like your fear of losing something important to you. That, she started just doing the obsessive things of pulling the plug out of the wall. But she even went so far as to bring her toaster with her to work in a bag. And even then, she worried. Like, she had the toaster in the car next to her, but she still had to go back and make sure. It's this inability to get rid of the obsessive thoughts that say, yeah, but yeah, but yeah, but it might, it might, it might. It's a really debilitating disorder. And so if you suffer with this, someone in my life has suffered with this and has gotten wonderful treatment. It's no picnic to have to go through. I don't want to minimize it. But this approach of relabeling, of being able to just know that you have a disorder, your brain messages that are telling you the toaster's going to catch on fire, label it as deceptive, reframe it as it's not true, it's not you, it's your brain just firing the wrong neurons. When you refocus it and revalue, you can actually retrain your brain to be calm in the face of obsessive thoughts. This is not a picnic. I wouldn't recommend doing it by yourself, but with help, this has very good treatment outcomes. We talked a little bit about PTSD before. And I'm just, without going into in detail about it, I want to tell you that somatic experiencing is an interesting treatment for PTSD. Basically, it's creating an awareness of inner sensation, and the sensations inside the body are now releasing traumatic memory. And as your traumatic memory releases, you let your body complete the defensive reaction. So, like, the body needs to sort of complete its escape, or if it's flight, if it's fight, if it's whatever the defensive reaction is. Sometimes this theory is that the memories stay with you because the body didn't get to complete its predetermined sequence of response. And so they found that this was very effective with people with PTSD. Here's a nice article about it, and this is the guy who thought about it if you're interested. So somatoform disorders. This is mental distress expressed in the body. So this is where you're upset, maybe you're afraid, maybe you're distressed, you're angry, and it actually takes root and has a physical result. So this could be pain, vomiting, paralysis, blindness, and they extend over years, and they're not caused by physical factors. And the thing that's sort of sad about this is, you know, so often, like especially in the older days, doctors would just say, this is all in your head. It's not like you're not paralyzed. It's not like you're not vomiting or going blind. Like, these are real problems. I think people are better nowadays about working with people and their underlying, I'm just going to call it upset, that may be causing these deep pains. There's a really good book about backache that's related to this. And if you have an aching back, email me and I'll find you the reference. Mood disorders. So most of us are familiar with depression. And what we need to do when we understand mood disorders is that this is mostly about how you feel, right? So depression is different than bipolar, even though depression is low feelings, sad, empty, irritable. Sometimes there's anger associated with depression too, and they interfere with your functioning. Like, you can't get out of bed for weeks at a time. Like, I've certainly not been able to get out of bed for most of a day at certain times in my life. But, like, the severity of it is diagnosed by a professional. Bipolar has these deep, deep lows, but also these manic highs, unreasonable elation and hyperactivity, where you think you can do anything and you stay up all night. So basically your body is really dysregulated. So let me show you, it looks like, yeah. So let me show you which of these lines. Here you have elated mood, Here you have a normal mood, and here you have a clinically depressed mood. Now this red line, this blue line, let's look at the blue line. This blue line goes from normal to low. Maybe it gets a little bit better but stays below normal and then might hit normal again. That's what a depression looks like. This red line goes up into elation and mania and dips way low into a clinical depression. This is more dangerous. There's more suicide associated with bipolar, in part because it's really hard to take any action when you're down in the low state. But when you get all that energy again, you can maybe act on some of your more negative thoughts. So, how prevalent are antidepressants? You should know that from 1994 to 2008, antidepressant use increased 400%. Nearly 1 in 4 women in their 40s and 50s take antidepressants. That's hardly abnormal if 1 in 4 people are doing it. There's a higher percentage of whites who take antidepressants than blacks or Mexican Americans. Why is that? Is it because one problem in racism in medicine is sometimes the pain of minority isn't treated with as much respect or concern or prescriptions. Most people, or maybe these populations aren't as depressed, which would be a nice fine how do you do. Most people taking antidepressants, 2 out of 3, have not seen a mental health professional in the past year. Now, this bothers me. 2 out of 3 people taking an antidepressant haven't seen a mental health professional. Why does that bother me? It's because I think that mental health, well, you'll see. In fact, I'm going to move on to the next slide. What are the causes of depressive disorders? Yes, there can be biological causes. Yes, there can be imbalances in neurotransmitters and brain functions. But one of the big problems with this model is that once they found evidence that the brains of depressed people were different than the brains of non-depressed people, they assumed, at least back in, let's say, the 80s, when I came of age, that meant that you're born with it. There's nothing you can do. You were born different. And the reason why that makes me sad is because one of my cousins was really, really brought into this idea. So rather than getting the kind of psychosocial support that she needed, she got an awful lot of medication. She's doing better now. But, so some of the psychosocial causes can be internalized negative emotions. You start feeling bad, and no one ever tells you that it's normal to feel bad in these situations. So you think there's something wrong with you. So you start to think that you're bad. Blocked positive growth or learned helplessness. The feeling that everything you do just leads to more pain. Now, I want to recommend this book to you because I am encouraging you to think of depression as not entirely physical, that there are social causes. It's like causes that you can look at, the aspects of our culture and aspects of our lives where we can make changes in our circumstances and our lives, and they can help our depression. And that's this book called Lost Connections. He basically believes that losing connections with other people is naturally causing us to be depressed, this epidemic of depression. So it's a good book. Now, I thought it was important for you to, we read a lot about these psychological disorders, but I thought it was important for you to see how does depression feel? And so I found this particular blogger who just said, here's what I want people to know about what it feels like to have depression. And he said, the negative thoughts won't stop. I know I shouldn't feel bad, but I do. Don't ask me why. I don't know why. I'm always exhausted. I feel guilty. I feel like I'm a burden to everybody. And sometimes I can have good days. Doesn't mean my depression is gone. My mind is lying to me all the time. It tells me I'm a burden. It tells me I just need to be alone. That's a big lie. It tells me no one loves me or cares. It tells me I will always feel this way. It tells me I am how I feel, and if how I feel is bad, then I am bad. It tells me I'm not strong enough. So then, what I like about this blogger is he says, if you see me telling lies to myself, let me know. So sometimes that's all we can do to help friends with depression. And just a note about suicide, we spent some time talking about this already. Suicide can be seen as a permanent response to a temporary problem. And there are some facts about suicide. I don't think we went over it, but it is not, I'm going to just run through these. It is not rare for people to think about suicide. However, if you're thinking about how to commit suicide, or if you know someone who is, that's a more serious warning sign. So thinking, oh, God, I just want to die, like of embarrassment, I want to die of shame, or is different than how fast do I have to be going to go over the guardrail? That's a really different thought. Suicides, here's the thing. Suicides are not necessarily caused by depression. Plenty of people are depressed and they don't have suicide. People take their lives to end their pain? Nope, not necessarily. Some people end their lives because they think they're a burden. So that's why one of my most favorite things you can do for someone who is struggling is just tell them how much of a difference they make for you in your life. Just tell them that truth, because they're telling themselves they don't matter, they don't matter, they don't matter. The risk of suicide decreases as people to start to come out of their depression? Nope, because when they get more energy, they get more will to take action, and the risk increases. And lastly, men are more likely than women to die by suicide, and I'm going to tell you why. It's because men tend to use guns, and guns are the most effective means of killing yourself. So I know there are a lot of Americans who love to have guns in the house, but you need to know that the risk of suicide occurring in a house with a gun in it goes up higher. You need to know that's a very big risk. So, talking about personality disorders. Again, we have to just keep flying through these. What makes it a personality disorder? It's because the disorder is more like a trait than a temporary problem. It's chronic, inflexible, maladaptive. So there's something wrong with your personality. We talked a little bit about borderline personality disorder. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on, but I'm going to say, here's some nice, interesting, a link to success stories about dialectical behavior therapy, which has been found to be a very effective treatment of this disorder. There was a time when it was thought to be untreatable, but now it is understood to be quite treatable. Antisocial personality disorder. Those of you who want to be criminologists, and want a career in solving crimes, you're probably most interested in this personality disorder. But I tend to not give it that much play in my class because it gets so much play on all the TV shows, on all the little TV channels. And I watch them a lot too. But the truth is, it's a very, very, there's so much more antisocial crime going on TV than there is in life. So I'm going to have to look that up for future lectures, like by magnitude of, I don't know. But this is where a person lacks conscience, lacks remorse, lacks empathy. And what I thought was interesting, usually men have this instead of women. Usually the onset might be around age 8 as a conduct disorder, where like they just don't respond to punishment. They just don't respond to things like, don't hurt Bobby, that hurts Bobby, don't do that. Like people who have a normal functioning empathy system, it bothers them to hurt someone else. People with this problem, it doesn't bother them at all. And there are subtypes. For example, the nomadic subtype isn't necessarily going to be, they're antisocial, but they're just roaming around, not really causing harm, but not really settling down, not forming the bonds that we expect. Malevolent, that would be criminal. Covetous, risk-taking, people who just aren't afraid of, they say, the social risks, so they'll do anything. Sometimes I think of certain social media influencers might be this type, right? And reputation defending, where all they have is their reputation, so they may go out of their way. Another personality disorder to be on the lookout for is, especially in bosses and people you're dating, is narcissistic personality disorder. I really want you to print this out and and review it after every first date, because this is not an easy one to deal with. It's an exaggerated sense of one's own ability, a constant need for attention and affirmation and praise, the belief that you're special, the rules don't apply to you, fantasies about attaining success and power, exploiting other people for personal gain, a sense of entitlement, an expectation of special treatment, the preoccupation with power and success, feeling envious of others, or believing that others are envious of you. Oh, they're just jealous, and a lack of empathy for others. Now, I don't know if this reminds you of anybody in the political arena, but it reminds me of somebody. I'll just leave you to draw your own conclusions. Schizophrenia. This is a type of disorder that is dealing with major disturbances in perception. So here you're hearing voices. Your language, you may be using language in a funny way. Your thought is really jumbled. Your emotions are off the wall and your behavior is strange. But this is largely characterized by distortions in your perception. You may have hallucinations or hear voices. So hallucinations are different than delusions. I just want you to know. A hallucination is a false perception. Like, I'm seeing a shining light from the Virgin Mary who is telling me to do my laundry or whatever. Like, that could be a false perception. But it's different than a delusion. Like, I may have a delusion of grandeur. Like, I'm the best psychology teacher that there ever was. Hopefully, no, I don't have that delusion. Although you guys, in your nice comments, make me feel good about myself, I don't think I'm the best that ever was. Or delusions of control. They may see somebody trip and fall across the street and think, I made them do that, right? It's kind of creepy. There's exaggerated, fluctuating emotions, or like a flattened affect. And sometimes this condition can get so extreme, they get cataleptic, basically comatose. I met a man who was catatonically schizophrenic. He was the first person who taught me meditation, actually. He came out of, he went in and out of comas from schizophrenia. And somewhere along the line, someone taught him to meditate. And he was a lovely man. He used meditation to get better. It took him a while, was according to his story, but he was a beautiful man. Now, there's a lot of evidence that there are genetic causes for schizophrenia, certainly a vulnerability to schizophrenia. So not everybody with these genes are necessarily going to end up getting schizophrenia, but there's an environmental stress. So, for example, there's like a 1 in 2 chance, a 50% chance, that if you have an identical twin with schizophrenia, you're going to get schizophrenia. So it's again with these twin studies that tell us about genetics. But let's go right back down to, if you have a sibling, a sibling with schizophrenia, you only have a 9% chance of developing it. It's still much more elevated than the general population, where the general population only has a 1% chance of getting schizophrenia. So I'll tell you, I have a sibling who was diagnosed in his early 20s with schizophrenia and has led a hard life. And I have for years, now I'm in my 50s, and I'm no longer afraid of developing schizophrenia. Thank you. But all the way into my early 30s, I really was afraid that there may be some environmental stressor or something was going to snap in me and it was going to get me. This is a real fear that people who have family members who are mentally ill, I'm not the only one who's been afraid of this. Um, so we are over time. And I just really want to respect your time and let you know that here we have dissociative disorders. I'm just going to tell you about the thing about a dissociative disorder is that there's a break in consciousness. So maybe it's an amnesia. Maybe it's you lose time. Maybe here in this dissociative identity disorder, it's split personalities. And also known as multiple personality disorders. Very rare, also fascinating. Oh, we're coming to the end. Culture general symptoms of disorders. So basically, this means that, we were talking about what does it mean to have a mental disorder and a psychological disorder. And basically, anywhere you go in the world, sorry about that, guys, these symptoms are seen as troublesome, worrisome. If you're feeling alone, if you feel like you can't get along with others, when you feel hot all over, that's seen as a problem. If you're worrying all the time, when you think you can't do anything worthwhile, that's seen as a problem. When you say to yourself, nothing turns out right, nervousness, restlessness, low spirits, feeling weak, worries, trouble sleeping, wherever you go in the world, at least that we've been able to study, these are seen as problems, symptoms. There are also culture-bound symptoms. These are symptoms where it's only seen to be a problem in that culture. I'm going to let you read them on your own. I think they're interesting. But the last thought I want to leave you with is the thought of resilience. So, in as much as the stresses and the weaknesses in our gene and the faults in our environment may lead some of us to develop mental disorders, and if we do, as we'll talk about next week, there are ways to treat all mental disorders. There are ways to make it better. There's also the fact that there's such a thing as resilience, meaning people can find themselves in really difficult upbringings. And resilience has been studied, and it is defined as the ability to adapt and recover in the face of adversity. So, this is related to good intellect. That doesn't mean high IQ. That means the ability to think well, to think and analyze and question. So, all the things that I'm trying to teach you to do in this class, like ask a question about that, reflect on it, connect it to your own experience. All of that is hopefully something that I'm not only am I teaching you psychology, but I hopefully am building resilience in you. If you have a relationship with caring others, and if you work on and develop emotional regulation, the ability to have emotions and process them and learn from them, is the kind of thing that will then result in your resilience, your ability to be essentially okay in the face of your adversity. And this trait can lead to post-traumatic growth. So even when bad things happen to you, like you lost your job or someone you love gets gravely ill or dies unexpectedly, even if you're in a victim of a crime or a car accident, like you can use some of these skills and traits like optimism, a sense that you can make a difference in your life. You can use this to actually use the trauma to grow even more than you would have if it had never happened. Okay, that's enough of that. We went over, but isn't this an interesting topic? You could spend a whole rest of your educational career studying it. Anyway, see you next time.